Please welcome to the stage Division Head of Application Support at Jülich Supercomputing Center, Bernd Mohr.
Yeah, good morning. For our invited speaker session, we have two amazing speakers lined up. And the first one is Estela Suarez. She is currently a senior principal solution architect at SiPearl. That's the company who's doing the European processor. So Europe wants to become independent, and so that company is doing it. She is at that company since September this year, while she is on sabbatical from her position as a joint lead in my center. She is leading the novel system architecture design division at Jülich Supercomputing Center, and she's also an associate professor of high performance computing at the University of Bonn. So please welcome Estela Suarez. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm really pleased to be here. I would like to present you some of the highlights, recent scientific highlights that has been achieved using our high-performance computing systems. Because we spent the whole week here discussing about amazing new technologies that come up, how to make our computers better, how to operate them better. But at the end of the day, these systems that we are having there in so many computer centers are instruments for science. So they are scientific instruments that allow to have, to reach new scientific results and also have an impact in society. So what I have done is next, thank you. So I have asked several people from computer centers around the world to send me, so I did kind of a survey, to send me a few highlights that have recently been achieved by users of their HPC facilities. I tried to reach quite widely, but of course I couldn't ask everybody, so if you miss your favorite computer centers, it's probably my fault. The good thing is that the reply to, so my target was actually not to look into the applications that are the most compute intensive or the ones that scale largest to the machines, but was mostly about what are really the high impact. I nevertheless asked them also to tell me a little bit how they use the systems, how was the interaction with those HPC users, if there was some co-design or some support involved. I received a huge response, and I would really like to thank everybody that contributed to this talk, because it's allowed me to show a wide variety from many different scientific fields. And to be honest, I had so many responses, so many replies, that I had to make some filters. So it's my personal selection, what I did here, what I thought would be more interesting for you to hear about. And I'm trying to explain to you in a relatively high level these examples. There are references there. Everybody that is interested in any particular use case, I would really recommend to go and look into the publications. It's just a glimpse of what HPC is achieving for science today. And again, thank you all for all the contributors. So I selected 5 general areas from physics, chemistry, medicine, culture, and climate. And I will go through them and show you some of the highlights that have been achieved with HPC, starting by physics. And to be more precise, I will start by astrophysics, which is actually my background. So a study, one of the highlights that was provided was about studying supernovas. Supernovas, as you know, are the end of life from stars when they explode and have a very high luminosity event, like you see on the picture on the top left. This very bright light is a supernova. It's so bright, this kind of supernova, that is considered a candlelight, so a reference for the light in the universe. When this luminosity stops, so what remains is so-called a supernova remnant, and this is the beautiful picture from the Crab Nebula from NASA. At the core of this, so when the star collapses and the star becomes what is called a white dwarf, which is this very small spot on the top left of the picture. This is called Sirius B. It's one white dwarf. There is no nuclear reactions there anymore. But for a supernova to happen, what happens is that there is a reignition in this white dwarf that again generates nuclear reactions, and then this collapse furthermore, it can end up in a neutron star or in a black hole. And I know this black hole is actually from the center of a galaxy, but I take the license to just show it here for the case of a supernova. So people using the Argonne computing facility have studied the core collapse of supernovas, because the interesting thing is that although supernovas have been observed for many centuries, and there are historical documents that show it, the real process, how this explosion happened, is not really understood. And the author of this work actually is cited here. So it has taken 60 years to accumulate the computational capacity to be able to have a high-fidelity representation of the explosion of a supernova. What happened in the beginning is they were doing simulations in 1 dimension, in 2 dimensions, and these simulations didn't end up in an explosion, as you see in nature. It required 3-dimensional simulations containing all the complexity of the interactions between the neutrinos and matter interactions, nuclear physics, and everything else around to represent it properly. They used 2 systems at Argonne, Theta and Polaris. They used 2 million node hours on the one, 500 million node hours on the other, and it scaled up to several thousands of nodes, so 2,000 to 3,000 nodes on the first system. They had support. They were working together with people from NVIDIA and, for porting to GPUs, and people from on-site, also then porting later on to Aurora. And they also had some support from the people from Argonne to do visualization of the results, which was one of the finalists from SC24 visualization showcase. The result of this work was the largest collection of 3-dimensional supernova simulations. And you can visualize this in this very nice video. So this starts with the collapse, and then the external shell of the stars start expanding. You realize this is far from being a spherical geometry. It's very important that these asymmetries start, because this is a fundamental part of the triggering then the explosion. There is a lot of contribution from neutrino matter interaction there, and the different colors here also show you different chemical materials. The blue one is nickel, and later on you will see the picture that is evolving, and you see how quickly these things happen. You see the time on the top. This is 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds is the real time of this kind of event. You see the geometry, 26,000 kilometers, and how really this happens in nature. So only HPC allows you to do this kind of simulations from ab initio, from first principles. In the universe and in this kind of things, I mentioned particle physics plays an important role. And this is also one of the fields that heavily uses HPC. This study here done at the Jülich Supercomputing Center, it's simulating quantum many-body problem, which is a very complex physics and phenomenon quantum field theory. The difficulty of calculating this is that you need to integrate a function that oscillates heavily from positive to negative values. And this is a numerical problem, so at the end these things cancel, and the results are not really a final representation of what really happens. This is a really hard problem, design problem in quantum field theory, and these researchers developed a new method to kind of attack it that is called wave function matching. They were able to solve with this method the same problem for ab initio calculations. They were able to map the complex problem they wanted to solve that has this sign issue. They map it to a more simple one that you can resolve numerically, and then to match the differences, they applied perturbation theory, so to make up for the difference between the simple and the real complex one. They run on jewels. They also run on the Oak Ridge and the system, and you see it's about 40 million core hours. It's not really high scale, so it's 64 nodes. For some of you in HPC, this might sound not so much, but it's a really important result, scientific result. So it enables calculations that would be otherwise impossible, giving new insights on nuclear interactions, reproducing things like nuclear binding energies or nuclear matter saturation, and it has potential applications on classical and quantum computing. So this is theoretical particle physics. Another use case for HPC is experimental particle physics. So when you have collisions in jets, so jet collisions, jets of particles, I'm showing here just an example from CERN, how the 4 main instruments of the LHC see the collision of lead-ion collisions. So these are lots of detectors collecting lots of data. They need then the scientists to identify what exactly are the particles that have been generated, what are their energies, which are their paths. And what has been done using the NERSC facility is to produce a foundation model for the analysis of that data, foundation model for jet physics. They were able to apply this to have improved classification, to have reach a faster convergence in generative model for simulation. They improve also detector unfolding and sensitivity in anomaly detection. So the interesting thing of using this foundation model is that while training the foundation model requires lots of compute power, hundreds of GPUs, when you do then the fine-tuning, you can analyze an event on one of these jet physics just with a single GPU. So it really optimizes a lot the use of the computer. One important thing there in this project was also to have one person dedicated at NERSC for this research group. It shows also how important it is to have support teams on the HPC centers that help users to optimize and to run their codes. Another aspect, again, in physics is plasma physics. There is an application called PyCon GPU that is applied for things like simulation of magnetic reconnection. And this is important for solar physics, for the physics around black holes, as we saw before in the first example, but also for fusion physics. And this video there shows you how a laser hits a cryogenic hydrogen jet. And you got to see ejected are protons. This kind of experiment can be used, for example, to use the protons for cancer therapy. So it's very important to precisely understand the phenomena that happens in these interactions in plasma physics. This was one of the codes that was first ported to Frontier, to the exascale system at Oak Ridge. They achieved 4 times performance improvement. Actually, that was the target between their previous runs on Summit to Frontier. And this, of course, also involved porting to a different computer architecture from NVIDIA GPUs to AMD GPUs. They achieved now that this code runs on over 73,000 AMD MI250, which is over 9,000 nodes of Frontier, with a very, very high GPU utilization, so up to 98%. And this was possible thanks to very tight co-design interaction between the developers of the code and the people at Oak Ridge and also at AMD. So it shows you how important to have these early users also in the hardening of the software installation and of the new installations of such large and complex systems. They achieved with this improved code getting closer to closing the gap between the experimental setups that are done in plasma physics in the labs and their simulation, so to get as close as possible to reality. They produce a general framework that can be used also for other use cases for processing at scale in transit streaming data. So the problem they have is that there's a lot of data that is produced by some of these experiments. They need to then do machine learning, applying it over it. But the file system capacity and the file system bandwidth is not enough to do this just saving and storing all the time. So they had to circumvent it. They had to then direct streaming into the machine. This kind of data streaming, they do this with one experiment. Their goal is actually to do this also for many experiments at the same time, so combining the data of different sources. So moving on to the next topic, to chemistry and materials. I'd like to show you one of the highlights that has been done at the CSCS in Switzerland. They did a study, or some of their users worked on the discovery of 2D materials. What are 2D materials? They are materials that when you have them in bulk, you can easily extract very, very thin layers out of them by mechanical or by other means. And these very, very thin layers, just in some cases lower or smaller than 10 angstroms, have very interesting properties. They can be, for example, combining different materials, create new layered systems that are called van der Waals materials that can be tuned depending on what you select. for different applications in engineering and in technical applications. Important or interesting for us is, for example, that they can be used for transistors. So you can have 2D materials that are used for transistors, and then have a more optimized computing devices, which is something we are really, really looking forward. Their work running on the pit stain system, they use HPC to run to huge databases, filtering databases of materials combinations. They filter to the best suitable candidates, so finding what is those that are likely to be able to be exfoliated easily. They use over 300,000 node hours on the pit stain system, and they were also part of a support program called PASSI, in which they developed a new library for quantum espresso running on GPUs. With this work, they were able to discover over 3,000 novel 2D materials, which are promising candidates for beyond silicon electronic, optoelectronics, and quantum computing. So here is something like HPC is helping on something that at the end might help HPC back. Also in chemistry, that's an important highlight this year, is the Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2024, heavily using HPC. So the Nobel Prize in Chemistry has two parts. I'm speaking here about only half of the Nobel Prize, which is the one awarded to Professor David Baker. He got the Nobel Prize for computational protein design, and they were among the first users having access to the perlmutter system and NERSC when it arrived. They used 1.5 million GPU hours in perlmutter to run their AI-enhanced pipelines. And the interesting thing of this new protein design is they are developing de novo proteins, meaning they don't exist in nature. So the nature, you can say, it has just developed the amount of proteins it needed, but there are other combinations that are possible and that have applications in pharmaceuticals to generate, for example, vaccines or nanomaterials or tiny sensors. Some examples, so this one of their earlier results in 2016, that was a protein de novo compound in which new nanomaterials were with up to 120 proteins spontaneously merged together. Another use case is when you have proteins, the ring ones that are attached to nanoparticles to imitate the shape and the form of a virus, and you can use this as a vaccine to teach the human body to attack these kind of things before the virus arrives, so to train it in a sense. Or more recently, geometrically shaped proteins that change the shape due to external influence, or you can do detectors with this. So if you look at the example in the middle, this is something very close to medicine, so they are doing vaccines for influenza, and they have already been successful testing this on animal models. And this brings me to the next topic, which is medicine. Also an important use case in HPC. Some researchers have, so there's a very important problem in medicine and in society in general, which is Alzheimer's disease. With the aging of society, this is an illness that comes more frequently. And what happens in the brain of Alzheimer's disease patients is that there is a protein called amyloid beta that accumulates in the brain. It starts by creating monomers. They're on the top right of the picture. They aggregate into oligomers. They then create some fibers that are called fibrils. And these then again aggregate and create plaques that get closer, accumulate, and attach to the neurons and to the brain cells and hinder their proper function. So the brain starts degrading in a sense. So drug development, what tries to do is to dissolve these plaques, to basically break them apart so that the brain can continue working properly without this disturbance. But for drug diseases, for drug development, sorry, it's important the whole process that they have to go through. So when people doing drug development, they start by going through very large databases with computational models trying to identify particular combinations or particular candidates. They do then lab tests, and if these lab tests pass through, then they start with preclinical tests that is testing them on small rodents, typically mouses or small animals. If this shows to be effective and not to have negative effects, then is when you have the clinical trials with very small populations, of course, first. And once this test is successful, then this finally becomes a product that you can buy on the pharmacy. However, it's very difficult to go through the whole process, and many cases it stops in the middle, so the drugs are effective on rodents, but they don't transfer, this effectiveness doesn't work then on humans. The highlight I want to show you now is a study that exactly looks into this. So it exactly looks into the structures, these fibrils that the amyloid beta generates on the animal models, on the mouse models, and they have been studied with cryo-electron microscopy, seeing that different types of mouse, they have different structures, different fibrils creation. They used HPC to then analyze the cryo-electron microscopy data, because this is two-dimensional data that has to be then put together to generate three-dimensional models, and they ran this on the Eureka system at ULH. The result is they could identify which is precisely the mouse model that is closest possible to the human fibril, so to the one that appears in humans with Alzheimer's disease, in particular with sporadic Alzheimer. That sounds weird, it might be sounding harmless, but in fact that's the kind of Alzheimer that more than 90% of the population with this illness have. It just means you don't have any genetic precondition to this, it just happens to you and you don't really know where it comes from. So this kind of a study allows, therefore, to identify which is the exact mouse model you need to use for the drug testing, for the preclinical testings, but it's also important, for example, to identify which is, so to test PET imaging traces, so make sure that then the images you try to do when you run on humans, if they work on mouse, this in the closest model, it's likely they will work on the humans as well. So looking about drug binding, still it's also used for attacking viruses, so drugs that defend you from viruses like SARS-CoV. The drug binds to the virus and prevents, in particular to the shell of the virus, and prevents that this enters into the cell and then you get the illness. That's work from the Barcelona, or done at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, where they studied, the problem is that when you have, these drugs, these are proteins that attach to the shell of the virus, but when the virus mutates, when the protein, the target protein on the shell of the virus changes, this attachment doesn't work anymore. So basically the drug stops working, it stops having their effect. It's therefore very important to understand where these kind of mutations can happen to develop better drugs. They use HPC to make hybrid quantum mechanics, molecular mechanics simulations. They run on over 14 or almost 15 million core hours on the Mare Nostrum 5 system, running many replicas of the simulation, with each replica running around up to 100 nodes. So, wait, doesn't work so well. They identified 5 locations prone to mutations, so locations on this target protein in which there might be happening a mutation that hinders the binding. It has to do with hydrogen bonding. If you see there on the top right in the picture, these red dashes are the hydrogen bonds. The more you have, the more easily the drug attaches to the target protein. But when you have a mutation, then you have less positions in which this kind of binding appears. So using HPC, they were able then to identify where this happened, and knowing that, you can develop future drugs that are more effective to this kind of mutations. So we move on to culture. I wanted to show you something which is not only natural science, which seems to be the most frequent use case for HPC. So I showed 2 highlights from this area, which is, I just call it generated culture. You can also call it social science. Starting by language translation. So I speak quite fluently German, but that's one tool that actually saves my life very often, because I need to write German texts, and not always my grammar is perfect. So I use things like this. And it's fantastic if your language is on this list. Or, I mean, this is just one example. There are other tools that allow you to do that. So if you are one of these lucky people that have this language, or your target language is one of these, then you are good. But what happens if you have this language there? Anyone has an idea what this language is? Probably not, but at least I didn't know. So tools like this DeepL are quite smart. You can just plug a text there, and they try to identify which language this is. And this says this is Estonian, okay? And it starts happily translating, saying something about a fox and a warthog and whatever. And then you come to this area and they say, okay, no idea what you told me there, so it just repeats exactly the same thing. This language is a language called Livonian. It's actually a language that the last person is speaking it died in 2013 at the age of 103. So it's one of these so-called dead languages. This is from it's a language that is spoken in the area of Estonia, Latvia, so in these Baltic states. It has so some people are learning it again in this area, but still there are very, very few people speaking it. And the problem is that when the language disappears, all the culture around this language disappears with it. So literature, folklore, history, no one else is able to read them anymore. It's a similar situation what happens with Old Egyptian or Maya language. So the people using the LUMI system in CSCS in Finland have developed a natural language process system called Tartu NLP to translate 23 Finno-Ugric languages, which are languages related to Finnish or to Hungarian, but which are very, very few populations, very few people speaking them. This is the first time these languages are integrated on the translation engines, which was achieved as using LumiC and LumiG with this given amount of CPU and GPU core hours. And this allows you now to translate literature, history, folklore, preserving and making this kind of culture accessible more widely. Another example from, generally speaking, social sciences is a study that looks into how cooperation appears and evolves. We are a community that relies heavily on cooperation. Our projects are typically very highly cooperative projects. The thing is that one interesting research question is how this phenomenon of cooperation appears at all and is evolving over time. So you can define cooperation as when an individual gives something to another without directly having something back. Whether this person decides to cooperate or not will depend on kind of the reputation of the second. So does this, Alice in this case, thinks that Bob is a good person or does she think it's a bad person? And depending on this, she will decide whether to cooperate or not. Generally, in society, we consider cooperation good and deflections on reaction or not doing it as bad. That's when you have two individuals, easy to understand and to describe. When you have a very large population and very large sets of social norms, this very quickly becomes very complex. So individuals see how others behave. You see how one people cooperates with another, whether one person does deflect to another, and they decide what they think of each other. So each person has an opinion on the reputation of all the rest of the group. And as this evolves over time, the larger your population is, the larger the number of social norms you involve, the more complex the problem becomes. So they did a simulation with just 50 members in this group, and they require 550 million simulations to evolve this. So this is work done at Fugaku, at the LCCS system, where they studied how cooperation emerges and evolves, and they used evolutionary theory, basically in the assumption that successful social norms will spread, and those that are not successful will just disappear. And they studied this concept of indirect reciprocity. So when one person cooperates to another without receiving directly something back, but because his or her reputation improves, you get indirectly from someone else this cooperation. They used 200,000 node hours on Fugaku with around 1,000 to 2,000 nodes per job. And the result that they found is that it heavily depends on the structure of the population whether this cooperation succeeds or not. It's easier when populations have some structure, some smaller communities, which is natural the way it happens in nature. So you have your family, your group of friends, the people that speak your language, and so on. So, last but not least, I wanted to get into climate change, and I had so many examples from climate change, but Peter will also speak about this right after me, so I didn't want to take too many of those. I just selected two. The first one is about prediction of severe droughts. So with climate change, severe droughts appear more often. It has consequences in agriculture and also on the more frequent appearance of wildfires. And this is work done at Argonne. They developed a new method to predict what are called flash droughts, so those that happen very, very quickly. They used a new index using something called the vapor pressure deficit. So drought is not just that it doesn't rain. It has also to do with how much humidity the air is able to absorb from the humidity that's out there. And they defined a threshold that this is 9 kilopascal, that is corresponding to something like 46 degrees Celsius or 114 degrees Fahrenheit, so relatively hot. And you see the prediction they do for the next 25, 50 years, how hot it will become. They use these systems, Intrepid, Mira, and Theta at Argonne. They estimated with an estimated compute time of around 1 million node hours. They used 10 years of simulation data, which shows you how important it is to have this data preserved over time. And what they predict is, as you see there in the picture, is that in areas like in the California Central Valley, there will be additionally 100 days per year that are over this threshold, additional to what we have today. So it's quite a heavy prediction. So this is just summarizing it again. So on the left side, you have humidity. On the right side, you have temperature. That's the historical data, how it has been until now for the months of the summer. If you look into mid-century, it's already getting warmer. You see the temperature in Fahrenheit and in degrees Celsius, and that's the prediction for the late century. It's getting quite grim. So it's important, therefore, when you see this kind of predictions, what can you do about it? And that's one of the targets of the project Destination Earth from ECMWF, that I'm sure Peter will be speaking about it later. ECMWF does many things. They also do weather prediction, but their work on the Destination Earth project is doing something which is called the digital twins of the Earth. And this particular use case is a climate digital twin that is used to determine which is the impact scenarios or policies. So you can simulate with this copy of the planet what happens if I apply a policy that reduces the emissions on the particular region of the Earth. How will this impact in long term? They use these two codes, IFS Nemo and ICON, and they run on the two systems, LUMI at CSCS and Mare Nostrum at BSC. They also had, from the teams on their sides, strong user support for solving challenges on porting. So these are two different architectures, and therefore you have to port the code from different generations and different kind of node hardware, but also the software environment, compilers and things like this were important. So this was my last use case. I want just to finalize with some observations that I've seen on the cases, the ones I show and also the ones I couldn't, that I received. I see more digital twins. I showed the one from the Earth, but there were other use cases. More AI for science with foundation models, with data assimilation and interpretation. Tighter link between experiments and HPC that then tried to collect the data directly from the experiments. And many challenges that I've seen where we're dealing with moving data around and also with the challenge of porting between different architectures. I hope that these few examples give you an idea of how important is HPC as an engine for scientific progress and also to tackle the societal problems. And with this, I leave you just with a video of this climate digital twin that shows you how it allows you to study different, so they say the planet from different climate perspectives. And I thank you all for your attention and all the contributors for their contributions, basically. Thank you. So I spoke a bit long, but we still have time for a couple of questions. Are there any questions? No. So, yes, there is a question over there.
Hi.
Yes.
Great talk. And I like the fact that you summarized what we're sort of doing worldwide in HPC.
Yeah.
A lot of your examples had 2 or more systems that were running. Were they running in parallel? Were they sort of working off each other? Or were they running sequentially and doing different runs?
They were typically running in parallel, let's say, to study different parts. So they often are done in cooperation. So these are scientific results that are done in cooperations, and some of the parts of this cooperation, they run on one system and some run on the other. The thing on the digital twin, for example, they run part of the simulations on the Mare Nostrum, they run part on LumiC. Yeah. Question over there?
Yeah, so I appreciate your talk and the broad background that you explained, so thank you. Were there any indications from the respondents that you received about resource limitations? Because that's often a topic that comes up, access to resources, given the different architectures that are needed for different science domain computations. So I'd be curious if they indicated any challenges with availability or funding.
Well, I have to say I got the input from the HPC center, so I didn't got the input directly from the users, which I guess would be the ones more complaining about the lack of compute time. There can always be more compute time, and I know it as having been at an HPC site that they are normally oversubscribed, so you have more applications that you can have access to. But I didn't get any particular feedback of whether this is a dramatic situation or whether this could be better, but it's okay. No. Thank you. Okay, so I think, unless there's one last question, I would like to, thank you again for your attention and looking forward for the presentation from Peter. Thank you.
Great talk.
Thank you.